In the early modern period, we also see a dramatic improvement and advancement in cannon technology. Now, cannons had been around since the 1300s, but by the 18th and 19th century, as a result of industrial innovation and technological advancement, we see cannon technology really improving in terms of the consistency with which the weapons could be fired, the rapidity with which the weapons could be fired, and the distance as well as trajectory of these weapons. So learning how to triangulate positions, learning how to use these weapons more effectively. If you take a look here on the left top corner of the screen, you'll note in the Franco-Prussian War, the Napoleon gun played a major role. It also played a major role in the American Civil War. Both the North and the South utilized the Napoleon gun. The Napoleon gun was a smoothbore cannon. It fired a 12-pound cannon shot, although there was also a 16 and 24-pound cannon shot. So these were just devastating weapons. And the Napoleon gun, or Napoleon cannon, was used against advancing troops. So this was a weapon that was set on the battlefield in between the rank and file and then fired directly at opposing troops. And the objective for both sides was to situate the Napoleon gun in such a way that it could take out the opposing enemy's cannon. And so these weapons were, they tried to direct their fire at the opposing cannon, but often they ended up taking out troops, and just an absolutely devastating weapon. You can imagine what a 12 or 16-pound cannon shot would do to an individual. Really quite awful. Now, if you take a look at the right bottom corner, you'll note that in the American Civil War, the North also had the opportunity to use the howitzer. And the howitzer was an absolutely devastating weapon. This one was not used against advancing troops. Rather, this was a weapon that was used against enemy fortifications and installations. And so the idea with the howitzer is to tilt the barrel of the weapon upward and then to try and coordinate a position in order to drop the cannon or the ammunition onto an enemy target. And I will also tell you that by the end of the American Civil War, they were also experimenting with what we call canister ammunition, where essentially they would load up a canister with grape shot or ball bearings, and the idea was that when the weapon was discharged, that the canister would peel away and it would kind of have a spread formation for the grape shot or the interior ammunition to spread in order to maximize the range in which the target was going to be hit. And so an absolutely devastating weapon was the howitzer. We also see some major advances in terms of naval technology. We are looking at an image here of the HMS Warrior. This is a British ship. It was commissioned in October of 1861. This is the first iron-hulled and armor-plated warship. And I will tell you that the HMS Warrior absolutely revolutionized naval warfare, because from the minute that this ship was introduced, it basically made wood-hulled ships obsolete, particularly when it came to warfare, because there was no way that a cannon fire or weapons fire from an enemy ship could penetrate the exterior hull of this ship. That is not until they developed even more powerful ammunition, but that was some ways off. And so this gave the Brits a decided advantage in naval warfare. And I will tell you that the HMS Warrior, its design was immediately copied by the French, by the Spanish, by the Americans. Everyone wanted to have their own armor-plated warship. And so ironclad warships meant the end of wood-hulled sailing ships as a means of transporting cargo, and certainly as it regards warfare. And as you can see here, this was a very elaborate ship. It still exists today. You can tour it if you ever travel to England. We should also talk a little bit about the development of American ironclads. So understand that the Americans had a very close relationship with the British and with the French. There was an exchange of technology and ideas that had been going on for a very long time. And so the Americans weren't far behind Europeans when it came to developing this technology. And in many ways, the Americans not only copied from the Europeans, but they also advanced the technology. They innovated in order to come up with some remarkable designs. The top two images that you see there are of Union ironclads. The Union produced 70 some odd ironclads during the American Civil War, and they did this by essentially taking a wood-hulled sailing ship and then attaching 2-inch thick iron armor plating to the exterior of the ships. That is how they initially began developing ironclads, and then soon they moved away from wood-hulled sailing ships altogether towards these ironclads. And these were some remarkable designs. The one on the top right, as you can see, it's just barely above the waterline, and so although this was a seaworthy ship, by plating it with armor, it weighted it down to such a degree that just barely was above the waterline, but this was a seaworthy ship, as you can see from the image here. These were some remarkable vessels, and they would advance very rapidly from the time of the American Civil War. Bottom left corner, you'll note this is an image of the USS Monitor. The USS Monitor was a wood-hulled ship that was then converted into an ironclad. It was a devastating weapon of warfare, and as you can see from the image there, it had a large iron turret, or an ironclad turret, that actually spun in 360 degrees. There were two 10-inch guns mounted within the turret of the USS Monitor, so it could fire in every direction. And as you can see from the image here, there is some damage to the turret itself. This had been in it had been in a battle with the U.S. or the Confederate ship, the Merrimack. The Merrimack was actually renamed the Virginia. It was another ironclad, and in fact, it's important to note that the Confederates were the first to develop ironclad technology. The Confederacy was always fighting from a place of disadvantage, and thus they embraced what we might call asymmetrical warfare, meaning because the Confederate States of America never had a technological advantage or an advantage in terms of the number of warships, they had to utilize other ways of trying to gain an advantage, and they did this through technological innovation, through subterfuge, through the element of surprise. And so the Confederacy was the first to really experiment with the ironclad warship. But unbeknownst to the Confederacy, the Union was on to the design and knew what they were doing, and so they introduced their own ironclad, and you see it here, the Monitor, right around the same time that the Confederate States of America ship, the Virginia, was commissioned and deployed. If you take a look at the bottom right there, you'll note that the Confederacy was also experimenting with submarine or submersible technology, but submarines during the American Civil War were essentially death traps. They were extremely dangerous. They often sunk for no apparent reason, or they surfaced for no apparent reason, and then surface ships would attack them and shoot them down. And so this was an extremely dangerous job, being a sailor in one of these submarines during the American Civil War. But it is important to note that with the advent of submarine or submersible technology, it would move forward very, very rapidly, and the Confederate States of America were one of the first to really embrace this technology as a means of gaining a military advantage. Other advancements in weaponry included the ring bayonet. The bayonet was essentially attached or affixed to the end of a musket, and then they would use this when they moved in for close quarters combat. This was a devastating weapon, and as I mentioned previously, soldiers tried to avoid hand-to-hand combat because it was very unlikely that you would survive being speared in the gut from a ring bayonet. We also see the development of breech-loading rifles. So not only do we see a move away from musket technology, but towards rifled musket technology. And it began during the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, there were German gunsmiths in Kentucky and Pennsylvania who would actually manually score the interior of a smoothbore musket and rifle it, essentially. They would create these spiraled grooves on the inside of a musket. It was extremely meticulous and painstaking work. And there were only a few professional gunsmiths who could do this here in America. But we see a shift away from the smoothbore towards the rifled musket. The rifled musket was a much better weapon because it was more accurate. It could fire from further away. And so rifles will become the standard by the American Civil War and some of the wars that we're going to see in France and Britain and Europe moving forward. Now, the image that we see top right here is of a breech-loaded weapon. So the move away from muzzle-loaded weapons towards breech-loading weapons happens right around the time of the American Civil War once again. Now, the reason I keep talking about the American Civil War is you have to understand that the Confederacy in particular imported many of its weapons from Britain. And so Europe played a pivotal role in the American Civil War because they were providing a lot of the cannons, the Napoleon guns, the weaponry that was used by both sides, although as time went on, both the North and the South would produce many of their own weapons as well. So a breech-loading weapon is essentially a weapon that is fired from the back of the that is loaded from the back of the weapon rather than muzzle loading. So this was very important because we see right around 1863, right around the midway point of the American Civil War, the introduction of breech-loading rifled muskets. This meant that soldiers could reload their weapon more quickly. It was an easier way to do it. It was less time consuming, and it increased firing capacity from 3 shots per minute to about 6 shots per minute. So this was a major advance in gun technology during the American Civil War. Bottom left, you see the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun, there were quite a few different versions of the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was one of them. The Hotchkiss cannon was another. These were weapons that were produced both in Europe and the United States. There were many different manufacturers. They were all kind of copying technology from one another. This was an absolutely devastating weapon. The Gatling gun or the Hotchkiss cannon, which is very much like the weapon that you see here. These were crank action, repeating, revolving barrel weapons. And as you can see from this weapon here, this is a multi-barreled weapon. The barrels actually spun. There was a cartridge that was placed in the top. The soldier would crank the weapon from the back, and the barrels would spin and discharge the ammunition. This was essentially a machine gun, but as you can see from the barrels, this was a very large caliber weapon, absolutely devastating when it was introduced in the 1870s and 1880s. I will also tell you that when the Hotchkiss cannon and Gatling gun, when these weapons were first introduced, they were actually water cooled. This was a problem because within just a few short weeks, they would begin to rust. They had a lot of problems with jamming, very problematic, and many soldiers that were deployed to fire these weapons hated the job because so often the weapons would jam, and then they would have to spend many critical minutes trying to clear the jam, and during that time they were being fired upon. And so this was pretty hazardous work, although by the 1880s they had worked out most of the kinks, and these were much more effective and reliable and devastating weapons of warfare. Bottom right, you see the Colt revolver. The Colt revolver was first introduced in 1835. This was a 5-shot revolver. Eventually, they'd also have a 6- and 7-shot revolver. And the reason why the revolver was so important in terms of warfare is because it allowed men to fire from horseback. Prior to 1835, soldiers on horseback had to dismount in order to fire their musket or their rifle. This was a problem. And so the Colt revolver and other handguns, if you will, were very important because it freed up the soldier. They could stay on the horse, they could hold on to the horse with one hand, and they could fire their weapon with the other. And so this was a major innovation in warfare, was the Colt revolver. And there would be many different versions of the Colt revolver in the 1840s and 1850s as they innovated and improved this weapon. The Winchester repeating rifle was a major innovation. It is often called the weapon that won the West. Many frontiersmen, many people that were moving west embraced the Winchester repeater. It had a 7-shot capacity. The magazine held 7 shots and another in the chamber. And this was a very important weapon in terms of allowing soldiers to gain a technological advantage against their enemies. Often we're talking about indigenous people, Native Americans, and so both Europeans and Americans would embrace the Winchester repeater. In the 19th century, we see many wars of conquest and colonial wars. These new weapons allowed Europeans to expand, to colonize, to imperialize, and to dominate the globe. Europeans would use their advantage in military technology in order to expand, to conquer, and to dominate the world. Their opponents were often severely outmatched and forced to fight with things like throwing axes and spears and blades and other rudimentary weapons. It was not a fair fight. If you take a look at this image, we have a mortar. Just look at the shot that was used for this mortar. This was an absolutely devastating weapon. And again, we're looking at an image of the American Civil War. The American Civil War is often considered to be the first modern war in world history because so many new technologies were developed as a result of the American Industrial Revolution. It allowed human beings to kill each other much more effectively. And so the weapons are becoming larger, more powerful, more devastating, and we're only going to see increased innovation and technological advance after the American Civil War. In the early 20th century, we see the introduction of the machine gun. Now, the machine gun, again, was a weapon. As you can see, it's got belt ammunition. The belt runs right through the cartridge. And this was just an absolutely devastating weapon because, some of the African and Asian resistance forces had guns, but their guns were not as good. European invaders consistently had better guns, and they were always improving the technology. So there was this consistent firearms technology gap. So, one of the disadvantages that indigenous Americans had, that Africans had, that Asian peoples had is that although they were often acquiring weapons from Europeans due to colonial contacts and due to the world being increasingly globalized and people being brought together, is that African peoples, Asian peoples, indigenous American peoples, they were able to acquire technology. They were able to acquire guns, but Europeans were never willing to sell them the most advanced or the latest technologically advanced weapons. And so there's always this consistent technology gap, which worked against what we might call less developed nations or colonized nations in the 19th and 20th century. Now we have here a good example of this technology gap and what this meant to both Europeans and less advanced peoples. And when I say less advanced, I mean simply the fact that they did not have some of the technologically advanced weaponry that Europeans did. The Battle of Omdurman took place in Sudan in the year 1898. So right around the turn of the 20th century, we have this battle versus British forces, versus the Sudanese army. And the Sudanese, again, they had firearms, they had guns, they had other technologies, but they were not nearly as advanced. And so in one of the most lopsided victories in military history, the British killed over 11,000 Sudanese soldiers while only 48 British soldiers lost their lives. And so this says a lot about the ability of Europeans in using more advanced military formations, in understanding logistics and military technology, how they were able not only to improve their capacity and ability to destroy an enemy foe, but also to provision their soldiers, protect their soldiers, defend their soldiers, take the high ground. They're really applying concepts of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment to warfare in order to more effectively destroy an opposing force. And this had some rather insidious implications for less developed nations and their peoples. All right, that's what we have for today. A rather brief set of lectures for week 10, but moving forward we're going to talk in much more detail about rulers with guns and European expansion globally. So as we move forward, I'd like you all to just understand that we will be talking in much more detail about response, the response and reaction to the problems of industrialism and how it is that global imperialism had both beneficial consequences but also much more destructive consequences. Everyone have a good week.